Hey guys, welcome back to another Tim Cain video. Today, this one, design committee versus collaboration. This one's a bit older. I scrolled down quite a ways in the list. So we're going to see nice, young, and handsome Tim Cain and design committee versus collaboration. I'll probably have a lot to say on this because I am a designer, so let's see what he says.
Hi everyone, it's me, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
And today I want to talk about design by committee
Yeah.
versus design by collaboration. In fact, I want to answer a question by CyberCop0083, who asks, you are critical of games by committee. Can you draw an approximate line between a committee product and a collaborative one? Yes, I can. And yes, I am very critical of design by committee because I've never seen a committee make a good product.
Yeah, it's like too many cooks in the kitchen, right? You know, it's not that you can't have a lot of people in the kitchen. Well, maybe the kitchen is not the greatest metaphor here, but the design is not just making low-level changes and choices and decisions about the game, but it's also making high-level decisions too. And those high-level decisions, while I would argue are fewer in number, are a lot more impactful than those low-level decisions in some cases. So you don't want to have a whole bunch of people making those high-level decisions because that has a lot of impact on the rest of the game. And if you have 10 people in a room, you're not going to see the game exactly the same way, and you're not going to want the same things out of it. Even 10 RPG players who love, let's say, you're making like a game like Dragon Age Origins, may not fully agree on what some of those systems should or shouldn't look like, or different ways to take the game. Inevitably, somebody is going to have to be where the buck stops. That's exactly why the term "the buck stops here" exists. Somebody has to be the person that just breaks that stalemate, and that's different from collaboration, where you're working with other people to find the best idea. Whereas design by committee is just taking the most number of votes for an idea. Well, what if the rest of the people aren't designers and they think that this is I've been in exactly this situation before, actually, with a change to the gameplay in Train Life. When we worked on it, there was a feature that was heavily modified, let's say, or arguably it was removed from the game by people who thought that idea was better, accepted that those people making that decision, without my input, by the way, made that decision, and the players didn't like it. Like, what are you going to do? So that's where, you need to leave design decisions up to people whose job it is to make design decisions. And that doesn't mean that they are going to make the best decisions at all times, but you shouldn't leave the programming decisions or the code architecture decisions to somebody who does not have experience doing code architecture. It's just, as simple as that. That's why you hire people who are highly skilled in different vocations, is so that they can make the best decision for the best use cases. And like I said, somebody has to be where the buck stops.
And I'm not even talking games.
Hey, jokes.
But every good group that I've worked in, they've done better when it's collaboration versus committee.
Yes.
And let me talk about what I mean by that.
Okay.
By collaboration, I mean a bunch of people will work on one feature of the game. Maybe they're a strike team.
I was just going to say a strike team.
A loose affiliation of people on the bigger team who are all working on some product feature that needs some code and some art.
For those who don't know, a strike team is like we're implementing feature X today, right? We're starting on feature X. We know that we, put a designer on it. We need one programmer maximum for that, or maybe two. And let's throw the UI designer into that strike team as well. Some people might be shared between strike teams, by the way, but usually not. You want that heavy focus of a small team that can work very efficiently with minimal documentation. And, they replace documentation with just raw communication. Mixed circle jerk teams, a thing. So yeah, a strike team is just, a small group that's working on a feature very highly, focused on just that. They don't have to worry about anything else. And then you would assign like a producer either to that group or if you have like fewer producers, you would just have the producer jumping in between groups to say, hey, how's everything going? Okay, looks good, everything's fine. Any problems? Anything you need? Do you need somebody else added to the strike team? No, everything's good. Okay, and then jump over to the next strike team.
And some design. They all give their input. The final decision of that feature is made by the lead or the leads involved, and sometimes by someone above them. Like if
The creative
a
director,
tie
creative
needs
lead,
to
or
be
something.
broken or a feature goes in that people are like, I don't really think this fits. Usually there's one person in charge of the whole project. It used to be called project lead. Now it's often called game director or project director.
Yep.
That person will step in and make that final decision or break ties or whatever. Let's contrast this to a game being made by committee, which is, again, many people are working on a feature because it needs work from several people. And then any decisions are decided by vote. That, on the surface, that sounds awesome.
I mean, if you don't know anything about game dev, maybe it sounds awesome, or if you're not a very experienced designer, maybe it sounds correct. No bad feelings. Again, there's nobody is the arbiter of truth. Nobody is the person who has all the best ideas in the company. Anybody can have good ideas. And that doesn't always mean that the designers make the best decisions or people who aren't designers make the worst decisions. But usually, the job of a designer is to organize, to orchestrate those decisions, to blueprint them, to help communicate to the team how a feature or how an idea should be implemented, or to rework the feature a bit to fit with the rest of the game, or to fit within the pillars and what your game is trying to accomplish, the vision, right? That's why if you're an idea person, which doesn't really exist, but if you are somebody who thinks, oh yeah, I have great ideas, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a good game designer, because it's not your job to have ideas, it's your job to sort, organize, blueprint, manage those ideas. Design by committee as an experienced designer just sounds horrible, because I may know that something from my experience is the right move for a game, but that doesn't mean that the other people on the team have that, because it was never their job to think that way. It might be their job to program or to make art, and thinking about how the game is designed is really not something that they are super experienced with, or it's not even something that they might want to do. And so something can sound cool, it doesn't mean that it will be cool. But I've never worked in a place that's designed by committee, probably for very good reason. Thankfully, I never will ever do that.
But historically, I've discovered, literally by doing it both ways,
I'm glad you experimented with that.
Is always worse. And it basically boils down to, in this case, democracy doesn't work. And let me explain why. The first problem I see is that themes tend to get lost when you have a committee designed game. And by that I mean you end up with
True.
a bunch of inconsistent features. You may end up with, the person who made crafting loved crafting so much that all the best items come from crafting. And so now there's really no reason to ever use a dropped weapon or a quest reward weapon, because the best weapons all are made with crafting. It wasn't intended to be done that way.
Well, this is true. And even with open feature ownership, right, where I've worked in places that had open feature ownership. So if you, different way, wanted to be the feature owner of a farming system because maybe you really love farming, you could become the feature owner. That doesn't mean that you need to be the designer of farming, but that you're the person that has the vision for how that farming should look, and you work with a designer, maybe with other artists, maybe with a programmer, to determine how to make that get made. And so the designer in this case that would not be you, would be the person that you sit with to help make sure that your vision fits within the boundaries of the game and with the vision of the game, even though you are kind of the person that is in control of how farming is going to work and feel. there's still a somebody where the buck stops maybe with you on that feature ownership, but arguably it's still up to the designer how that gets implemented, but you're just the vision holder for that. So even in the cases where you could argue that you have the closest thing to a committee, which is like open feature ownership, it still isn't a committee. It's still that there is somebody who holds that vision for that feature, and there's still going to be the people that hold the vision, or a person that holds the vision for the game itself. But I think Tim brings up an excellent point where you might have people who don't understand that the best items in the game can't come from crafting, when they're maybe meant to come from another source or meant to be more well balanced. And if it's up to just that person to make that decision, it's not going to go well, right? It will end up with a game that just feels completely out of order.
Or if there's a theme like these two things will never mix. Like, take Arcanum. If Arcanum was made by a committee, you'd probably see lots of subquests where someone figured out how to mix magic and tech, even though the game and the manual and everything lead you to believe that magic and tech are antithetical. They can't mix. It's kind of the whole point of the setting and the story. And when you learn about history of the countries and powers in Arcanum, deciding to throw in something like, here's a magic gun, kind of throws all that into disarray. So when you end up with people who can vote things on to a game, you frequently find that consistency among the features isn't often considered.
I also feel I fear that in a case where there's design by committee, you kind of create like a dude, the office politics in a game development studio where you had design by committee would be so toxic. It would be so unbelievably toxic. You would go around lobbying your friends in order to try to convince them that your idea that was going to be voted on later today is the one that they should vote for. Oh my god, I didn't even think about that initially, but the office politics with design by committee would literally be the most toxic, destructive thing that could ever happen from like the design standpoint for a studio.
Isn't often considered, which leads me to my second problem.
Yeah.
If you look at ideas for the game and look at them individually, they can be really good ideas, but maybe they're not good for the game.
Well, exactly, yeah. Well, that's why I always argue that there's no bad game design. There's just design that doesn't work for the game that you're making, right? There's provably games that are made very janky, or they have a lot of bugs. And sometimes those bugs, if they're not like, crash bugs, which I think are a little bit more objectively bad than other bugs that are subjectively bad, subjective bugs can help to make a game more unique and more memorable. Everybody remembers being blasted to the air by giants in Skyrim. People love Goat Simulator because the entire point of the game was to make the most janky, broken game, as long as it didn't cause crash bugs, right? And that game has now had 3 games in the series and probably a 4th one in development.
I remember this was something that came up when I made the first Carbine setting. The setting was the center of the multiverse, and different multiverses were popping into existence on this one planet that was at the center. It was at coordinate 000 in every multiverse. So things could break through there from other multiverses. But that meant you could have robots and dragons and, cyber implants.
You can do whatever you want.
And, gods. It was weird. And
it's one of those it is really cool on paper. It's one of those things that I could see I could see it only making sense on a meta level, where you're trying to build a universe, and it kind of reminds you like Final Fantasy in a way, right? Now, I don't think that there's any shared universe between Final Fantasy, but maybe like a good example would be like Kingdom Hearts is kind of like a metaverse thing to me. where these aren't meant to exist in the same universe, but they do. So you can't make a game where it's all about these multiple universes, because then one game would either just be so ridiculously expensive to develop because you'd have to have so many different unique systems and ideas, but it could work where you have a series of games or a franchise that's based on this universe, or this one world, but there's maybe multiple things happening on at once, and one game just focuses on one area. And you could easily make them exist. Well, I could see it working. Just you'd have to make you'd have to make the multiverse theory work on like a top level and not on a per game basis. I don't know if that makes sense. But it is weird. It is weird, and it's like, okay, this is really cool, but maybe there's a better idea that isn't so complex and challenging from a explanation perspective.
And as someone pointed out to me, since everything can go in here, nothing really belongs here.
Yep.
And it's not that any one of those ideas are bad. It's just they don't all fit together. If you remember when I talked about how I put together designs, I said I always do setting, followed by story, followed by mechanics. And the reason I do that way is we decide on the setting first, and then you stick a pin in that. So made Fallout, it's post-apocalyptic. You put a pin in that. Then you come up with the story. Well, we want the story to be something that you can tell in a post-apocalyptic setting, the main story at least. And it would be dumb to pick something that doesn't have anything to do with the setting, because that's what people are there for. Then you make mechanics that support both your story and your setting. So mechanics, it made sense to have radiation and poison and have lots of gun skills and combat skills. But because we also said, hey, we're going to play through multiple ways, talking skill and stealth skills. If you went with a committee, you might have ended up with just all combat skills. You might end up with something that people are like, well, we really thought these were really cool. And no, the dialogue stuff was dumb. So enough people didn't support dialogue, so it never ended up as a possible way of solving any quests.
I mean, there is a way to design that starts with, it would be cool if blank. But this is, this is brainstorming. This is where you decide, well, what can we do? What can we do with this game? It would be cool if blank. And, I would hear that as a designer and say, well, that is pretty cool, but I don't know if it fits very well with our core pillars here, right? Or the vision of what the game is supposed to achieve. But what if we modified it to be like this? It starts that back and forth. And that's why there's nobody who has that ownership over over ideas as a whole, but ideas need to be thrown out and collaborated on, bounce back and forth between the rest of the team. But again, somebody has to make that decision.
And I will tell you, there were frequently times where people came up with a really good quest.
Yeah.
And I said, well, wait, you didn't put in a stealth path or a talking path. It's just combat.
And that's, I feel the same way with like potion effects in Golden Chronicles. People are like, it would be really cool to have this effect in the game. Well, you didn't think about how that effect might impact stories, right? How do we make that work? It's the same thing. It's just, we need to have multiple ways of solving these, our commissions, our NPC problems in Golden Chronicles, but also all the effects that need to work there need to work in combat and with the player too. There's tons of cool effects, but a lot of them just won't work because of our limitations, our desired limitations, that the effects need to be working in every situation.
And I remind them that this is one of the main story arc quests. So they had an option. Either it gets kicked out or it gets relegated to a side quest, and they still have to make a main story quest for that one that involves all three. So we had things like that I was just the final say in. And because I couldn't be overridden, it made people make all the story arcs having at least three ways of getting through
consistency. So it is a good thing.
The biggest problem I've ever seen.
Some people will see you as dictators, especially the people that whose ideas get rejected a lot. I've been in that situation where it's not that like somebody's ideas were necessarily bad; they just didn't work for the game that I was, kind of leading, and so I would reject most of their ideas. Or even if their ideas were good and I liked them, I had to say, well, we don't have the time to implement it. So, just like save it for a sequel if we can make one. Um, and then, of course, they just get the view that I'm a dictator, that I never listen to their ideas, that I always think that my ideas are better. It's like, well, no, it's just your ideas just don't work in most cases. And even when they do work, we don't have the time to implement them. Not all my ideas make it into the game either. A lot of my ideas get cut.
At least 3 ways of getting through it. The biggest problem I've ever seen in committee made games, the biggest one is loudness. You end up with the loudest person on the team gets the most of their ideas into the game. And this is where, it's...
Yeah, and like naturally just you'll have very passive people on the team that they might say like a really cool idea, but because there's somebody who's more loud, they feel timid and they won't say it ever again. This is what you were talking about? Oh, yeah.
Extrovert versus introvert. I know introverts hate this, where they go to a meeting and one or two people are dominating it, and they feel...
I think it's less to do with introversion. I mean, maybe there's a correlation. They're just really passive people. I mean, especially juniors, they're passive because they fear getting fired or they fear getting replaced, and so they don't want to go against the status quo. They feel, and in some cases it might be true, that their best choice is to just shut up and do the tasks that they're told to do and to never make a stink about anything. And that's the way that they'll be able to obtain some stability in the company and therefore some stability in their life. I was never this person, but I can understand how that is. I've been in communications with like people who were both type A personalities, right? Where we are both loud, we're both dominating, but because of that, there's neither of us is the winner. But we've been in conversations where we exist, but then somebody else exists, and so we have to tone ourselves back a little bit to help to talk with this person. But then once we're in private, we can go back to the way we normally talk. But not everybody can do that very well, and even I can't do that always perfectly well. Especially if you get like really passionate and like focused on a conversation, you can forget that somebody else is in that conversation too. It happens, and I can imagine that a design by committee is just very much like that, where, like Tim is saying, and he's going to put it in a better way than I ever can. The loud people, you have the politics, you have some backdoor. Hey, my idea is better, right? Come on, like let's vote for my idea. Your idea is cool, but let's save it for something else. I need your vote because then we can have a majority. Fucking lobbying.
Are dominating it, and they feel like they can't get anything in edgewise. And this is why I always say that accommodation has to go both ways. I try to get people who aren't talking to talk.
Yes.
But if they won't talk, and I've tried to get them to talk,
what can you do?
You have to meet me halfway here. I will shut down the person who's dominating the meeting, but you have to say something. Or you can read the minutes of the meeting and send me your idea in an email. So the loudness is a problem because, interestingly, if I listen to loudness here by like what people really clamor for, all my videos would be tech videos, code and tech of how I made RPGs. Even though
I'm glad that it isn't.
When I post those videos, they are the least watched. In other words, the people who are the loudest at asking for what they want are a minority. What people really seem to come here for are high-level descriptions of how to make games, stories of games being made, and as much code stuff as design stuff and
freshman.
Process on how games are made. So that's an interesting example right there. Is I can't just make nothing but code and tech stuff. Besides, there's a bunch of channels that do code. There's literally thousands of channels out there that show you how to code in C# for Unity. I don't need to do that here. I have so much other experience in different things. I should do something different.
There are a lot. There's just like two things that I see on YouTube, and I don't know if you guys agree with me, but there's a lot of coding channels, often by people who have never actually worked on games, teaching people how to make games, which is a little bit weird to me. And the same thing with design. There's a lot of like just high level design discussions from people who have never designed a game. I don't know. sometimes I get the feeling that there are more people that are interested in talking about how to make games than there are people who actually just want to sit down and make a game. Maybe because one is arguably easier and has a lower barrier of entry and success than another. But I don't know if I would listen to somebody talking about how to, design a game who has never designed a game. It's on Discord, just some about key request. What was that for? Give me a bit. I'm trying to work out the best way to distribute Steam keys for the beta test of Golden Chronicles. It's not beta. It's pre-alpha. It's pre-vertical slice even. I was originally going to do it with playtest, but I need to do it some other way, I think. So I just need to look into that. But don't worry, you won't miss a key. It's not like there's going to be a limited number of keys. I just need to find a way to distribute it via Steam in a way that is efficient and not requiring me to make a store page yet.
There's people who are coding in C# and Unity every day. They should probably be teaching you those classes.
Yes.
Similarly, there are other traits that happen on committees that I've watched override the committee and get things into the game that probably shouldn't. Things like charismatic people. They convince everybody their idea is best. Even when you put it in, remember, talked about fast fail and rapid prototyping, you put it in, it doesn't work.
Oh my god, dude. Charismatic people, I think, are some of the most dangerous people in game dev. And it's not the charisma itself is bad, it's charisma combined with ignorance. And oftentimes the people that are the most charismatic are also the most arrogant. Maybe I don't know, maybe there's a correlation there, maybe I just got unlucky, but I've worked with some extremely arrogant, extremely charismatic, extremely confident people who will just tell you that water is not wet and be very good at convincing you or trying to convince you that water is not wet. And they somehow are able to convince the managers and people above them that water is actually, in fact, not wet. And what can you do with that? Because at some point, I get it that a CEO or something has to put trust in the people that they've put in charge. And they can't be questioning or having people question the people that they've put in charge openly, right? It's just, you'd have constant mutiny. I get it. But if you're in a position where you're putting people in charge, you need to make the smart decision of putting people in charge who actually know what they're doing and can be good leaders. And I think that a lot of leaders mistake arrogance and confidence with quality leadership. And that's just not the case.
Remember, talked about fast fail and rapid prototyping. You put it in,
fast fail, work.
Yep. This is where it should get kicked out.
Yep.
But they're like, no, let's keep changing it. Let's change it. And they keep fiddling with it and waste a ton of time. You need to have someone go, boom, we're out.
There is a game that I worked on that is still not released. I think it still even has a store page that had exactly this problem. It was just the leader, again, arrogance, confidence, ignorance. The three worst instances to have. And he would just keep changing things. Like, oh, I'll change this thing, and I think it'll provide the fun. And so the thing would get changed. Still wasn't fun. And, eventually I went and I questioned it because I was pretty much a fresh pair of eyes. It wasn't even over scope. It was actually a very small scope. I was a fresh pair of eyes at that time, and I came in and I was like, what's your gameplay loop? What are your gameplay percentages? Like, what do you want the player to actually be doing minute to minute in this game? And they got very upset that I was pushing for this and they couldn't answer it. And, these are very basic questions that you think should be answerable. These are things that you should have in, the very basic documentation before you start the game is, what does the player do in the game? What are the focuses of the game? You know, what's the loop of this game? And they didn't have that, and it kept just going back and forth until the game just got funding pulled from it, and it's now in like development limbo. And I've been told a million times that it was being worked on, but it's never been worked on. I promise you, if you want to find that game, you can, because it's still not released, and I still don't think it even has a release date.
Persistence is another thing that people
Over
just
half a
keep
decade
bringing
later.
up an idea in a meeting. They go like, hey, why aren't we trying this? We should really try this. I saw this in a game. We should really do this. And so sometimes people are just broken down and go, fine, we're putting that feature. This is really close to another thing I've seen happen in committees where people will just be really annoying, like deliberately annoying, just so somebody will say, fine, we're putting your idea, so they just shut up. And I've seen that work. And I've even went to somebody after a meeting once. You were deliberately annoying in there, right? Well, I got my feature in, and I was like, whoa.
That's very toxic.
And then this goes to another one, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. I've seen someone suggest a feature that was bad. And when it got shot down, he said, you guys never let me put in any of my ideas. I haven't had an idea put in this game for months. And then out of this misguided sense of fairness, this bad feature is put in because you feel bad for the person and you want to be fair. I've done this. I've actually let features go into my games that I didn't really like, but I realized that the person who was suggesting it hadn't had an idea go in the game at all. So it's
as much as you want to do that, just to make that person feel better, you can't do that. The game, at the end of the day, a commercialized game is not meant for the developers, it's meant for the players, and that's where the money is regained on sold copies. Like I said, sometimes there are just people who aren't very good at thinking of ideas that fit with or that mesh well with the core idea of the game, because it's usually not their job. And they're just thinking of something that they think would be cool, but it is your job. If you were in that role where the buck stops with you, sometimes you have to be the bad guy. And it doesn't mean that you have to be the bad guy in a bad way. There are diplomatic ways to say no, but there are also some people that just won't take that diplomatic answer as a fair letdown. They just won't understand. They won't get it, and that it'll cause a controversy. I remember working with a game team that could never answer this one question I kept throwing at them: what happens when you die? They scaled up to 80 people and still couldn't answer that. The game was canceled millions of dollars later. Really? What the fuck? That's crazy. Like, somebody working on it would make it harder to answer that because each person would think something different on what should happen when they die. Well, that's not even that, but that's the thing. It's not up to those people of what happens when they die. It's up to, at the end of the day, one person, the project lead. I mean, you could say that, okay, he might delegate it to the designers, right? And just say, like, okay, yeah, that looks good. Let's do that. But it's like lead designer who, of course, is working on that with like lead artist, lead programmer, because the lead designer might want something crazy, but then the lead artist is like, dude, we can't do that. Like, we can't do that. Or the producer says, we don't have time for that. So it's like, it's a collaborative effort between trying to find the best idea with the least amount of resources that won't sacrifice value in the least amount of time. They just scaled it before figuring out their core loop. Dude, I've seen that. And they never figured it out, so we just wasted time, people, and a lot of money. Yeah, I've seen that. It's just... The Black Knight, I've had the same problem where people they seem to treat milestones as a date in the calendar. They seem to treat prototypes and like your vertical slice as just, oh, we passed the date in the calendar, that means we are past vertical slice. That's all it means, and never a set of qualitative and quantitative metrics that need to be met, or statements that need to be met and determined to be true in order to pass that stage. And this is exactly why one of the things I wrote up for actually for not just for Colden Chronicles, but for our company, for Microraptor, is what we mean by production stages and what needs to be met in order for that production stage to be considered passed. Like at the end of the vertical slice, in order to pass the stage, all team leaders must agree that the vertical slice achieves what we intended for it by answering a few important questions. Are all intended features and systems present in the vertical slice? Are all assets and features at a level of quality that could be released? Can the vertical slice be played without progression blocking bugs or crashes? Are all the pipelines well documented and thorough enough to accurately budget time and developers for the rest of production? Does the vertical slice capture and build upon the fun that was present in the first playable? I mean, these are difficult questions to answer, but they're simple questions to ask. And if you can't do this, then you're really not ready to be in game development, right? If you can't just treat this like it should. Because if you can't get your vertical slice properly, you really think your alpha and beta are going to go properly too. No, they're not. It was being run by a product guy from the publisher who didn't have a clue, hired a couple of ex-Blizzard people and thought that they would just win. The classic, hired 3 people that worked in a team of 100 and somehow they're going to be able to deliver that same thing. What if they were the 3 worst performing people? Or what if they only performed well because they had other competent teammates to assist them? Not like you just pick somebody out of a team of 300 people and randomly they're just going to be able to do every single thing that you need them to do. If they were in a team of 300 people, they're likely extremely specialized and need the support of other knowledgeable people. Which, I'm not saying that somebody from who's ex-Blizzard or ex-AAA is bad. It's just that they're often highly specialized. They might have a really good, head on their shoulders, but if they don't have the monetary support, the support of the right time, of the right team to build what they're trying to build, then they are not, that AAA experience is kind of meaningless. I'm sorry, Tim, I'm getting off on a tangent.
It's hard to be that benevolent dictator, but that kind of sense of fairness comes up in committees all the time.
Yeah.
Basically, what all this boils down to is a committee is just a form of a mob, and you really don't want mob rule in a game. All those things I mentioned, loudness, charisma, persistence, annoyingness, sense of fairness, all these lead to designs going in that shouldn't.
Well, even beyond that, they lead to a company that is built upon, I think, bringing out the most toxic traits or rewarding toxic traits. It's not that you can't have or don't want charismatic people in your company. It's not that you don't want people who are defensive and sometimes, very protective of an idea. But you want people that know how to separate ideas, especially their own ideas, from what is best for the game. And you don't want to encourage any of the qualities that Tim has mentioned. You don't want to encourage the being, you don't want to encourage being loud with being right. You don't want to encourage being guilt tripping with being right. You don't want to encourage the toxicity that can come from speaking behind people's backs and trying to win them over to your idea and to not support the idea of somebody else. None of those things will ever lead to a company that is stable or is building anything of significant value. It's just not good.
And if I could sum all this up in one sentence, games by committee tend to have their vision diluted.
If they even have a vision at that point.
You probably played games that were like, well, that was okay, that was interesting, but it was nothing memorable. That game probably had a committee or an inexperienced project lead. Because usually if one person is in charge of it, everything kind of goes in and lines up with what they want. Might not be a good vision.
Yep.
But it's a vision. In committee-made games, I often see the vision as this generic, well, it's kind of a fantasy game, and we go around and do fantasy quests and get money and treasure, and we go up, and we get new abilities.
Yeah, it's like we get XP, and there's things to do, and treasure chests to find, and like, okay, but why am I doing it? What's the point? If I've seen this game a million times, then why do I want to see it 1,000,001 times? Why would I want to give you money for a game that I've already played? What's the point of it?
then we beat up more fantasy monsters.
I would say that's not even, it's not always designed by committee that happens with, but also a, sorry, Tim, I paused you. You look scared there. There you go. Now you look you look a bit cringe at my design ideas. That's the face he makes when he cringes at my design ideas. But I can also see it happening with just too big a budget. Like we've talked about before, if you have a large game budget, you need to make that money back and probably more because you had investors, right? And they want profit. In order to do that, you have two things. You sell more copies, at a higher price or even at the same price, or just let's just say you sell more copies and you increase the size of the audience. And you increase the size of the audience by removing things that lower the size of the audience. But by doing that, you've now made such a generic game that you actually would have had a larger audience had you made something that was a little bit more risky, that people hadn't seen before. And we saw that like with Dragon Age Veilguard, or we see that in some cases with, I think Bethesda games are going down that route where they're watering down RPG systems, but by doing that, we now have a lot of games that just feel very similar. And there's just a point where you increase your target audience to maximum, but then if you go even further beyond it and water things down more, you're actually losing your audience. Now you're not making anything that says anything or has anything to say because there's nothing controversial. It felt like every line in Dragon Age Veilguard, as Carnage put it, was being written as if HR was in the room. And so I never was ethically questioned. I was never morally challenged in that game. It was just, okay, I said something nice to a character and they put a quip back at me. Haha. Nobody wants to play that.
Beat up more fantasy monsters. Okay. Seen those games in development.
Right.
Yikes. There's really just no strong vision there because it's being made by a whole bunch of people. Maybe they're being too nice and they're not trying to make their vision step forward, or maybe because it's a committee, they're putting in a mix of things from everybody and it becomes a hodgepodge of features and themes.
Yeah, it's like, hey, why don't you add sword combat to Golden Chronicles? Well, then because it's literally just another fantasy RPG at that point. Like we've taken out the thing that made it unique, that set it apart from its competitors. And yeah, maybe taking that thing out will limit its audience, but I would argue that in combination with the rest of the gameplay, by not adding that feature, even if it brings 20 more people to the game, let's just say, we have now made something that stands out a lot more and actually attracts more people because it's something that they haven't played, they haven't seen. Kind of designed by committee, but you need to have one vision holder that a final say. Well, that's what he's arguing, Cuthbert, that that collaboration is what you want, but then you have the vision holder to decide on that, right? So you can still have a committee of people that have input on design, but you still have that one vision holder.
But that is my distinction, CyberCop 0083, between a committee-made game and a collaboratively made game.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's a great video. Another great video. Why are we surprised that Tim Cain makes great videos? Here's the link, you guys. And if you're watching on YouTube, the link is down in the description. I agree with what Tim says. You need to be a vision holder. Even if the vision is not great, somebody needs to be in charge of that because it just does not lead to anything good in the team if you have multiple people that are tugging and pulling and having a tug of war on that game's vision. It doesn't work well. So thank you for watching on YouTube, and I will catch you on the next one.